Hey, many of you know, today is actually Ash Wednesday. How many of you knew that? I became a Christian in my late teens, and I never really went to like a liturgical church. I have participated in Ash Wednesday before, but I know some people carry baggage with them about these sorts of things, but I find it very fascinating. So I just wanted to tell you, if you're kind of like, I know what that is, what's that all about? Ash Wednesday is kind of ushering in the season of Lent as Christians for generations have set their sight on Easter, this great celebration. Ash Wednesday has kind of ushered in a season of repentance and prayer and confession of sins. And the idea of the ash is this idea of death and resurrection. And I don't know why this stands out, but somebody told me this a long time ago, and I thought there's no way that can be true, and it turns out it is. In very liturgical churches, the ashes that they use are actually from the burning of the palms from the previous year's Palm Sunday. So it's like the opposite of the celebration, and here comes the Messiah, and it's kind of turned on itself with the crucify him, and it's burned, and then put on our heads as to signify our repentance and our prayers for confession. So I just didn't want to be on video without mentioning it on Ash Wednesday because somebody will give me a hard time. A couple other things. I have been told over and over and over, and I'm ready to give it another try, but I'm going to do my best to repeat questions. And so if you're like, why is he repeating questions? That's for the YouTube audience that's just sending me lots of emails. So let's jump in. This is Matthew chapter 13. It looks like it's only 14 or 15 verses, but it is a really, really robust, kind of fruitful 14 verses. It's a lot of fun. I'm very excited about this. And before we begin, I wanted to kind of revisit some things. I put a chart here for you. We talked the last few weeks about the 7 parables of the kingdom. Everybody remember that? Now here is kind of the issue. The chart in front of you, if you just count them, has how many parables? 8. Okay, so that doesn't make any sense. If you went and looked this up, you would find not a heated debate, but you would find some disagreement. And the reason is that the last parable on your chart, the householder one that they're saying, many scholars and experts say it doesn't fit the profile of a true Jewish parable. The reason that people want to argue against it in some ways is because if you preserve the number 7 in Jewish culture, this means this is like the perfect, all-encompassing teaching about the kingdom of heaven, which I think is pretty cool. I find myself in camp 7 parables, not 8 personally, but we'll get there and you can decide for yourself. So a couple last things. Last week I told you I would look it up because I couldn't remember the word, and some of you guys are nerds. The word that I've been looking for when Matthew does this thing where he tells you a statement, it's like a bookend, and then he teaches a whole bunch of things, or he writes Jesus' teachings or a story, and then he rounds it out with a very similar phrase or even the exact same phrase. It's a story sandwich. And if you want to look these up, you could look them up. The technical term is intercalation. This sounds nerdy, but if you go for a deep dive, you'll realize that Matthew's using this all the time. And what he's doing in the Jewish mind that is very, very apt and kind of evolved in this time period for hearing things, not reading them. So the majority of people are coming and they're hearing people read these scriptures. What he's doing is he's cueing people off into where these teaching chunks should start and begin. And we're going to see one tonight. So I wanted to put this here. Right above your chart, this is where the piece of bread, if you will, begins. This is all the way back in chapter 13, verse 11. And it's to you, it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom. You guys remember this? From that point forward, Jesus teaches first the crowds and then his disciples these 7 parables. And then at the end of the teaching block, he says this, have you understood all of these things? So what he's basically saying is that everything I've told you is everything that you need to know if in faith you've received the parables to understand what the kingdom is all about. So we're going to talk about the final 3 parables tonight. I think this is going to kind of come more to life as we go, but I just wanted to point these things out. So let's jump in. Verse 44. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field Anybody ever read this story, like maybe when you were young and you were more kind of prone to daydreaming and letting your mind wander? What kind of treasure you all think this would be? What kind of treasure would cause somebody to sell everything they own to go get it? What is it? Mr. T. I like that. So just like a pile like this high of gold chains. Okay. I love Mr. T. He kind of disappeared. He was like in every advertising campaign for a long time. And in Rocky 3, that's right. Not as good as Rocky 4, though, when he defeats Ivan Drago. Might be a good movie to watch right now, actually. Okay, so a couple things we need to know, and then we're going to talk about this concept of the kingdom of heaven, because I think we just need kind of a review and then maybe a deep dive into it. The first thing we have to remember is that now Jesus is only talking to his disciples. The Bible has made this very clear, that the last few parables we've read are addressed to the crowds, and now these parables are addressed to the disciples. So we have to ask this question: why does Jesus reserve these ones for the disciples? So I think this is a question we can be thinking of, and we're going to try to answer it in a little while. The second thing I want to point out to you is, I think I highlighted this footnote number 1, is this idea of kingdom. We're going to talk about this chart here in a second. This is a pretty famous thing. I didn't make this up. Here's the deal about the kingdom. You may recall, how many of you have been around Matthew with us for 3 weeks now? How many of you have been around a while? Okay, do you guys remember all this interplay that's going on all the time about kings and kingship and the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of world? You guys remember all this? So you may recall that I think it's all the way back in chapter 2 or 3. We spent a lot of time in this, and it's really cool. It tells us that King Herod, hears this idea that maybe the Messiah has been born. He kills a bunch of babies, and then it says King Herod did this and King Herod did that. And then Jesus is born, and it says this was to fulfill the prophecy of what had been prophesied of old, that there was going to be a Messiah born. And then do you remember what happens next? The Bible never refers to King Herod as the king again. Do you remember that? The second it introduces Jesus as the king, then King Herod can't be the king. Why? Because a real kingdom can only have how many kings? One. There's this other teaching that many of you are familiar with where Jesus takes a coin. We've talked about this before, and it's got a picture of Caesar on it. And on the coin, there's an inscription. It says, Caesar is God. Yeah, Caesar is God. So Jesus holds this coin up. Everybody knows whose face is on it. And he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And so we read that, and we think, oh, that's a great teaching. But as I grew up saying in my household, them is fighting words, right? Because you can't say that Caesar is not God and expect to keep your life for very long, especially if you have a movement of people and you're blasting this out. So there is this theme that's emerging throughout the entire Gospel of Matthew, and it's basically, as Jesus ushers in the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of the earth and the kingdom of heaven, they have to coexist in some way. But really interesting, strange things start to happen when they collide. So let's talk about this kingdom of heaven for a second, because I had an email from last week that somebody was a little confused and curious about this. So there is this theology of the already but not yet. How many of you have heard that phrase before? It was coined, I think, by a pretty famous theologian named Dr. Ladd with 2 Ds, I think. You could look him up. I could be totally wrong. Here is the idea. This circle represents the kingdom of the earth, which is why I put it in lowercase k. And this is my adaptation of what used to be a circle, but every time I saw it drawn, I just thought it's so strange to think that the kingdom of heaven is bound by a circle. So I erased it and did my own artistic rendering with never-ending arrows. The idea is that we are living in this space right here. So when we pray, do we believe that miracles can happen? Yeah, that's something that happens over here. Does it always happen? Not always. I think everyone has an experience of this, where you're praying, and you're contending for it, it doesn't happen, and you're confused. Why? So the theological understanding is that the kingdom of heaven is here. Jesus has ushered it in, but it is not here in its full expression. when it comes in its full expression, the Bible tells us some things about it. How will we know it is here in its full expression? What will happen? Jesus will return and reign, right? And some of the characteristics that will happen is there will be no more what? No more sin, no more sickness, no more weeping, no more pain. Do you need to pray for miracles in the kingdom? No, because exactly how God intended the world and all of humankind will be ushered in its fullness. And you can ask somebody way smarter than me about all of the things that are going to happen, or you could read the book of Revelation. And if you have questions about Revelation, I just want to tell you this. Be very careful on YouTube. That's all I have. That's for free. Be very careful typing in, what does Revelation chapter 3:16 mean? You go on YouTube and you're going to get some wacky stuff. Is everybody on the same page here? Okay, so Jesus is talking about that somebody who is living in this kingdom goes into a field, and this treasure represents that they, lights go on, recognize that the kingdom is beginning to come. This is Jesus' prayer, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. He's inviting us to pray that the kingdom would come even more in its fullness as he ushers in it. All good? Okay, so this is what these parables are all about. It's about people who are living here that recognize this is real. So, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that's hidden in a field. So this idea of it's hidden, it's not plain to see, but we get this vision of someone who stumbles upon it. Now, I didn't know this, but I started looking, and it seems like a lot of ancient commentators, like famous ones, Augustine, basically everyone, when they write about this, and I can't figure out why this is, they assume that what's happening here is that this is a day laborer working in a field. So maybe they know something I don't know. I don't see that, but that's basically what they're all saying. So their idea is that somebody is working in the field. They're just a simple, basic, not overly intelligent, just a laborer trying to make a day's wage. And in that field, a man uncovered this treasure. And when he witnessed it, when he saw it with his own eyes, it says, in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Now, I think this is interesting because I was telling Victoria before that I feel like about 25% of everything I know about all the parables I learned in the last 1 month. And this is one of those things. So I was thinking, you know what, if these people know something I don't know, and this is a common everyday day laborer. You guys know a thing or two about these types of people? We've talked about it. These are people who work all day just to get enough wages, many times just to, eat a meal so they can have the energy to go do it again the next day, over and over and over and over. And if you're Jewish and you have to obey the Sabbath, by the way, and you're one of these people, giving up one workday is the difference sometimes of eating and not eating. So this is a difficult cycle to be in. Now, this person sells all that he has. This is an interesting concept. So what does he have? Not much, right? Now follow me. So he doesn't have much, but he sells it all. That's all I got. I got not much. So when you sell not much, how much money do you get for not much? Not much. And when you don't have that much money, what kind of field can you afford to buy? Not much. And as I was piecing this together and I was thinking about this, I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Because what this parable is saying is that the kingdom is hidden in a podunk little field. And if somebody stumbles upon it and recognizes it for what it is, it's worth selling absolutely everything just to buy it. Is that cool or what? So this is the idea that the man stumbles upon it by accident. It's not because he's an expert. It's not because somehow he has got tipped off that if you follow these coordinates, what's that thing called? It's like an adult geocaching. Thank you for reading my mind because I didn't even get the sentence out. I learned about this 10 years ago and I didn't think that was a real thing. Anybody ever been geocaching? It seems cool. I kind of want to try it. Do you guys know what that is? It's basically a scavenger hunt for adults, and you have to have a very nice GPS, and they give you the coordinates, and when you get there, how big is the space that it leads you to, Steve? Yeah, it'll be like on a trail, and you'll follow the coordinates. When you get there, you'll open it up, and it will be like an invitation to take something. Sometimes it's like a little note that the person before you wrote. Or oh, you're supposed to take something and leave something. Oh, that's a good concept, because if you just took, there wouldn't be anything left in the box. That's awesome. I kind of want to try it now. So this is the idea. This guy is not special. He doesn't have any insight that other people don't have about the field. He's literally just going about his life, and when he sees the treasure, he recognizes it for what it actually is, and he decides on the spot that it's worth everything, to get rid of everything to go get it. And he finds it all by accident. Now, the next parable follows the exact same sentence structure. It's the exact same action words all in a row, except this one is a little bit of a twist. So let's head to the next one, verse 45. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had, and he bought it. Okay, so does this guy find the great pearl by accident? No. Let's talk about being a pearl merchant. I think we've talked about pearls before. Anybody remember anything about pearls in the first century? Very valuable. And you know what? I had heard that before, and I thought, oh yeah, duh, pearls are valuable. And then I realized, like, where do pearls come from? They come from oysters deep in the ocean. And we have a hard time finding them all the time in 2022, and we have like all kinds of technology. So I got to imagine the amount of pearls available in the ancient world is very slim, even compared to what we have now. I actually put a footnote here for you. That in the 1st century BC, Julius Caesar thought that pearls should be the sign of high class and royalty in the empire. And so he actually banned wearing pearls by the lower classes of people. So lower class people aren't even allowed to own a pearl. They're not allowed to wear a pearl. It's against the law. Julius Caesar is like, you guys know who Julius Caesar is, right? Okay, good. So he basically bans it. He makes pearls the sign of extreme wealth, extreme nobility, and royalty. Okay, so who is a pearl merchant then? This is a guy who is well connected. Say that again? Yeah. He has some form of wealth. When you're well connected and you're wealthy, and you're good at your job, you must be really good at going to the market, looking at pearls and figuring out which ones are good, right? Because your clientele is going to be a wealthy clientele that expects the best, right? So what else can we kind of gather from this guy? He's looking at pearls, and he finds one single pearl that he determines is of such great value that he could sell all that he has to buy it. What does this guy have, for sure? Other pearls. He definitely has a collection of pearls if he's a merchant and he's dealing them, right? So he decides selling everything I own plus my entire pearl stash is worth one single pearl. Now, I didn't say this before about the treasure in a field, but if you sell everything you have and you buy a treasure in a field, are you missing some things? What kind of stuff are you missing? Like, did you sell your food stash? It says everything. Right? Did you sell your bed? Sounds like it. I don't think the illustration is trying to say like, oh, they impoverish themselves. I think the whole thing is to say people see it for what it is and they're willing to get rid of absolutely everything for it. The first guy does so for joy. The second guy does it because, in my understanding, to be a pearl merchant, you have been a pearl apprentice. You've graduated up. You've been trusted in the business. You know what you're doing. You know what you're looking at. You've been looking at pearls for, I don't know, years, decades. And then what comes across the table as you're sorting pearls? One single pearl. You've never seen anything even remotely as good as this. In your wheelhouse, this is the holy grail of pearls. And you immediately, actually, that's not true. It says, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it. Now, a wealthy person, how long does it take for him to sell off everything he has? Maybe a little while. Maybe it takes some time to let go of some things as he's selling it off. He takes the money, everything he can muster up, and he goes and he buys one single pearl. The first guy stumbled upon the treasure on accident. This guy does not stumble upon the kingdom. He finds it on purpose. In fact, he's been looking for it for a very, very long time. And when he sees it, because he's been training of what he's looking for, when he sees it, he recognizes it immediately. So, we started with a question about why does Jesus direct these parables only to the disciples? What do we know about these guys? What do we know about them? Where'd Jesus find them? Okay, they're fishermen, so they don't have much. They're not day laboring poor, but they're probably lower middle class if we had to distinguish, right? And Jesus is walking about by the seashore, and what does he say to them? Come follow me. And what do they leave behind? Everything. So what is Jesus telling them? You're this. You are this. This is you. What you're looking for as Jesus' ministry continues, and then his death and his resurrection, and he leaves the mission to them, is what you're looking for is people who respond to the gospel like you, who are willing to leave everything behind, even though they don't know the end of the story, they don't know where they're going to go, they get it wrong all the time. What you're looking for is somebody who's willing to give it all up to follow me. That's what Jesus is saying. And then he gives two examples. Some people are going to just stumble upon it. Some people you're going to say like, hey, do you want to follow Jesus? I have no idea. What does that mean? Well, he died for your sins. That sounds pretty awesome. And before you can even get out the whole gospel message, they're like, I'm in. I hear it. I stumbled upon it. I wasn't expecting this, but I just immediately recognize it to be worth leaving everything behind and following. Anybody know anybody like that? Anybody have that story? Or it was sort of like, I had nothing left, and then I heard the gospel, and I'm like, I want that. Anybody? That was kind of my story. I think I've told you this. I was sitting in a youth group room. I had been on a retreat. I had heard the Bible, and the youth pastor at the time said, hey, not wanting to put anyone on the spot, but just raise your hand if you would say that you identify as a Christian. And before I could even process with my mind, I had just put my hand up. And I was like, well, yeah, it's true. I don't really know when that actually happened, but I do remember I said a sinner's prayer, but I think I said I was a Christian before that. I don't know how it happened. It just did. I just heard it and realized I want that. I'm sold. But then Jesus says some people are going to be like this pearl merchant. They've been looking through squinted eyes. They've been reading the scriptures. They've been poring over them. They've been praying. I think what Jesus is talking about in this context is Jews who are on the lookout for the Messiah. And they might have some big questions, but they've been looking for it. And when they recognize who Jesus is, they think, you are what I've been looking for the whole time. I'm in too. Isn't that cool? So I put a question down here. Maybe you can just turn to one another. The question is, describe both the joy you experienced and the sacrifice you took to follow Jesus. And then if you get to there, how would you describe kind of a deeper level of selling everything to follow him in your own life? So why don't it take 3 or 4 minutes? You can turn to people next to you. You can kind of go with the question as it's written. Feel free to edit it to fit your conversation, but we'll reconvene in about 3 minutes. I'll start. I think one of the big hurdles I didn't anticipate was that becoming a Christian as a 17-year-old with kind of an established friend group was going to sacrifice a lot of friendships. Very quickly it became, you either continue this friendship and live a life of sin or pushing closely to that behavior a lot, or you have to draw a line in the sand and say, I'm going to stay on this side, and if you'd like to join me, that would be great. And realizing very quickly that 17-year-old boys more or less don't want to join you on your side of the line. That was a major sacrifice. And I laugh about it now, but at the time I remember feeling like, well, I guess I just went from fairly popular to having no friends, which nobody told me about when I signed up for this. Yeah. Anybody else want to share? Just the whole house full of Christians. Yeah, Wanda.
I think throughout my life, there were just different chapters in that regard. And just wanting to do what God wanted me to do. One was like leaving all the family when we went to Afghanistan. And then when we came back, I mean, even leaving my ex's family, I mean, I cried. I mean, sat at the airport and I cried because I didn't want his mother to think that I was leaving because I didn't want to be there, because of her or something. And coming back and then we went back to Colorado where my family lived, and then my ex got a scholarship to go to Biola. We came out here, so again, just leaving the family all behind and coming out here, not knowing a single soul out here in California.
Yeah.
And starting over again.
Yeah.
Everything, I mean, what we had fit, what we could, what we fit.
This is quite literally a leave things behind. How many of you have experienced a transition where you're like, I'm pretty sure, God, I hear what you're saying, but like, are you sure that's... How many of you experienced like God leading you in a way where you're like, nobody's going to think this makes sense at all? Anybody have that? Yeah. How about the joy? What would you say the joy of realizing who God is? Maybe even, for me, it was like the devastation of coming to grips with what sin really was and realizing that you are doing that. And then once you really realize that, the exceeding joy of knowing that Jesus has already dealt with the problem. Anybody want to share about their joy? Yeah, Marilyn. Yeah. It was just like immediate, like the old lifestyle that you loved so much wasn't even appealing anymore.
For me, it's freedom. Like, there's joy in experiencing freedom. You're no longer living for yourself, but you're living for someone who loves you, and it's just like, and you're free. You're no longer like, I just remember I was 16, around that same age as you, where it's just like, when you're 16, you're all about yourself, and your stuff, and then you're like, oh, if God loves me, then now I don't have to like, worry about being or like a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, as you were saying that, I was thinking about Paul, being handcuffed. I had just imagined him cuffed to like a wall and proclaiming how free he was. I think that's kind of it, like never been more free. Thank you guys for sharing. We're going to head to verse 47. This is the third parable, and I would argue the last, although the next one has a little language that leads maybe possibly a parable. And if you're on team 8 parables, I'm not your enemy. I just want to tell you that. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down, and they sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Okay, so the first thing we got to know is that this parable is directed to fishermen, and it is about fishing. Okay, so if this is the last parable and Jesus wants to drive home the point to a bunch of fishermen, it makes perfect sense that Jesus would say, I've been using like agricultural metaphors, I've been talking about gardening, I've been talking about fields and treasures. I'm going to wrap up by telling you one that's right up your alley, and it's about fishing. So he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a net. They know all about that. That gets thrown out there. And when you throw out a net, the net has no conscience to differentiate what's going to get trapped in it or not. You just pull up everything. We call this bycatch, right? Or we. Like I know anything about fishing. We call this. I've been fishing out on the ocean like 5 times, and now I'm like in the we. It's like when someone's like a hardcore sports fan, and they're like, oh man, we lost. And my dad used to say, you're not on the team. Like, you're right, Dad. We didn't lose. They lost, and I was emotionally invested in them. Yeah. Okay, so it gets pulled in, and there's fish of every kind. Now, I find this fascinating. I didn't know this. I didn't come up with this, and I frankly can't tell you exactly how this works. But multiple scholars say that there is some Greek phrase in here. I think it's every kind. It might be every kind. But it directly relates, and the only other time it's used in Matthew is in Matthew chapter 4. When Jesus is walking by the seashore and he says, "Come follow me, and I will make you fishers of..." There's something going on here where Jesus is alluding back to their calling. I will make you fishers of men, and now he's telling them a parable of what it looks like to fish for men. And he says the net goes overboard and it doesn't differentiate, it just catches everything it catches. And it gets pulled in, and then the fishermen, who are experts in fish, begin sorting it out. Now, what do fishermen sort fish for? He originally says the fish are good and bad, and then when he talks about people, he switches to calling it righteous and evil. So we'll get there in a second. But what makes a fish good or bad? Size, yeah. I mean, yes. I'm going to say bigger size is probably better. Yeah, what?
The type.
Type, yeah. Huh? Kosher or not, especially if you're Jewish, right? Kosher type. I think like maybe I'm just dumb and I got to start at the basics, but I just thought like edible is a good start. Like, yeah, you probably don't want to put puffer fish in there, right? I don't know, maybe if you got a huge haul and you got limited amount of resources in a world with no refrigeration, you're thinking, I got to pick the ones that I know are going to make the amount of money, so it's value or worth, right? All of these things go in, and then their opposites make them bad. Jesus is preaching to the choir on this one because he's talking to fishermen who, frankly, probably know more about fishing in some ways than he does. So he's saying this. I just think sometimes I read things, and I just think that has nothing to do with this necessarily, but it's so interesting. I just wanted to share it with you. It turns out that in large-scale fishing operations, the bycatch in the first century is usually used for fertilizer. So it's just ground up to be like a seed starter, or it's fed directly to animals. Like if you had a dog that was actually used to like guard or be a shepherding dog or something, you would grind up these fish and feed it to them. So basically it is worthless to humankind. That one's for free. Oh, the other thing I learned that I thought was really funny, I had no idea. There was like these whole fraudulent schemes in and around the Sea of Galilee to get away from Roman taxation. People would like run ahead of people taking especially census, and people would literally hide the bedding of children because they want the guy to come in. How many children do you have? Because you're going to pay taxes on all of them. Just one. Really? That sounds not possible. Can I come in? Come right in. And they would hide their things. So fishermen were looking out for each other. They were basically like trying to defraud the Roman government, which I thought was fascinating. Has nothing to do with this. Okay. So Jesus says this is the good and the bad fish. And then he turns the words and he says they threw away the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. Let's talk about that for a second. I think we've had this phrase, and maybe we had it last week, and I didn't feel like we had time to talk about it. Let's talk about the end of the age. What do we think when we think of this phrase? Okay, the second coming. So it's like we're here, here's our timeline, and then the second coming, or whatever is going to begin to usher in the second coming, kind of starts right here, maybe? Can you think of any biblical illustrations that are used to talk about this right when it begins? Or in that time frame, yeah? The day of the Lord, yeah, that's I think, either completely synonymous or close to it. What's that? Judgment Day, yeah. So can you think of any stories maybe that you know from Matthew about what this day looks like? Because I think we're learning here that Matthew is almost recycling. Well, Matthew's not doing it. Jesus is recycling imagery and then representing it in different ways. Have you noticed this? He's going to give this teaching in Matthew chapter 25. And he's going to say, the good shepherd, when he comes in his glory, he's going to sit on the throne. The king is going to come in his glory like a shepherd. All before him are going to be what? Sheep and goats, right? They've just kind of intermingled for a while, and now it's time to separate them. And he almost gives this very similar illustration. So similar, in fact, you could probably just change out the words. He says the goats will go off to the left, so the non-power position. And why will they go off to the left? Do you remember? I think we could boil it down into one sentence. They have failed to hear what Jesus has taught them and actually do it. He says, I was hungry and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me no water. I was naked, you didn't clothe me. And then what do they say? Do you remember? Well, we would have done it. We just didn't see you. And then what does he say? I already told you. When you do it for the least of these, you're doing it for me. And they're like, well, we didn't know. Right? The sheep, he says, congratulations, welcome to your eternal resting place. And they were like, how do we get here? And what does he say? I was hungry and you. And then what do they say to him? When did we see you? And they're equally surprised, right? They're equally surprised because they didn't recognize Jesus either. All they did was heard what Jesus said, and they went to go do it for the least of these. And then Jesus says, when you did it for the least of these, you were actually doing it for me. This is the separation. And so he begins to separate out. So let's talk about these two words that he contrasts. The end of the age is the beginning that starts with judgment, and it's the beginning of the complete ushering in of the kingdom of heaven that we talked about. Okay, so Jesus uses these words. He says fish are good and bad, but he says the people will be considered evil and righteous. Now again, our world hates this, but the Bible does not really leave any wiggle room here, does it? He doesn't say, oh man, the fish, when we get them out, there's a sliding scale, 1 to 10, and anything that's over 6 is a keeper, and anything between 1 and 6 is toss it in the trash, right? He doesn't say that. He uses very black and white language. This is usually the stuff that when people are not ready to hear the message of Jesus, they don't like this. But this is what he says. So this word in Greek, this evil, I think I maybe put a footnote in here. No, maybe not. Okay, so this word evil is an interesting word because it actually is kind of this moral failure, but it also gets translated sometimes as like pain, almost like emotional pain. And the idea for Jews is this is what you experience when you're living outside the will of God. It's a pretty all-encompassing, simple term. This word righteous at its core is this implication of innocence. For Jews, when they're told they're righteous, do you remember what Jesus says to them? Don't assume you're righteous just because your father is Abraham, right? So the idea of righteousness is that you are pronounced innocent because you are somehow God's chosen or elect person. This is because for Jews, they just believed I'm a son of the covenant, and so therefore I'm in. Jesus, I don't think Jesus is addressing that in this parable, but he definitely is going to address that that's not going to fly. So the idea is kind of an implication of innocence, a pronunciation of your innocence because of what Jesus has done in you. Okay. The end is kind of the same of what we experienced in the weeds and the wheat parable. We got these 3 images. We got the end of the age, which we talked about. The fiery furnace. I said last week, let's not jump to conclusions and just say hell. I Jesus never just takes chapters of the Bible and says, hey, sit down, I'm going to give you the entire doctrine of hell. Where we get that idea is kind of a stacking of all these illustrations. So in the midst of all of the agricultural parables, I think the furnace is representing more than like eternal hell. It's elimination because you are not what you were meant to be, more or less. So weeds get thrown in there because there's no good use for them and they need to be eliminated. Fish get thrown in there because there's no good use for them and they're not good for nourishment in life. But then he adds this phrase that leads us into like this concept of what we would call hell in some way. He says, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now you got to imagine if a fish is thrown into a furnace, they're not crying and gnashing their teeth, right? So Jesus is adding this illustration. He's beginning to stack ideas. And the idea of weeping is, of course, grief and pain and loss. And gnashing of teeth is apparently, I don't know, but everything I've read is always gnashing of teeth is what happens when somebody is in extreme pain. I think of those Westerns where they're like, I'm going to pull this bullet out of your leg with a bottle of whiskey, bite down on this towel. That's what I think of. Okay, verse 51. Okay, this is the other piece of bread on the other side of the parables. So Jesus says, have you understood all these things? And they said to him, yes. Yes, is what they say. There's some acknowledgement that I don't think they're lying. I think from what they understand in their heart, they truly believe to have understood all these things, right? But these things that Jesus has taught, I think this is what Jesus would say. What I've taught you are stories and parables and moral and ethical teachings. But remember what he always says, if you have ears to hear, then you should hear. And this is directly related to the Hebrew concept of, I know that you heard me because your actions show me that you heard me. So they say, yes, we understand, but they have yet to walk this out in real time. And so I think I can imagine Jesus with a smirk on his face of, oh, little do you know. But they say, yes, we understand. And he said to them, therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. This is a super cool passage. I love this passage. It's actually my favorite one of the night. I'll tell you why. I don't know that I fully grasped this idea of a scribe super well. You know, we always get these phrases like the scribes and the Pharisees, right? And I think maybe in my mind just kind of bulk the two together, but they're not the same. The idea of a scribe, in our culture, what do you think of when you think of a scribe? A translator would transcribe something, yeah. In fact, in our staff meetings sometimes when somebody needs to like take notes on the whiteboard, we say like, hey you're going to be the scribe, right? So the idea is like you're just like going to dictate notes. But that's not anything close to what this is in the Bible. Sometimes this word gets translated with another word. Do you know what it is? Lawyer, which is an interesting phrase. So who are these guys? And this is, I think, the disconnect for me. I think I understood that they're lawyers. They're highly, highly trained people who know the ins and the outs of all the Jewish law. These are very intelligent people. This is actually kind of a cool connection if you like language. The root word for scribe is, I think, this might be butchering it, but if we transliterated it to English, it's grammatus. It's the same exact word for grammar. It's kind of interesting. Okay, so this person, highly trained, very intelligent. They know the ins and outs of not only the Old Testament law, but they know every interpretation and all the commentary that goes along with it. So this is who these people are, and this is the part I don't think I totally understood, is that if you were living in a Jewish world, an expert in the law, so in our world, you get into a nasty car accident, you call one of these hokey 1-800 numbers that advertises every other commercial on AM radio, you know? And so there's like lawyers, they're out there, and you only call them if you need them or you have trouble with the law. And I'm raised in this culture, and that's what I think of. If you are Jewish, there is no differentiation between your religion, the way you live your everyday life, and the law. It's all one thing. There's no separation of it. So I think what I've thought of as scribes is, oh, these terrible people, whatever. When I need an interpretation, I'll go to them. No, these are the people writing out the interpretation of the law that affects how you're going to live your life. Because they're saying, this is what the 10 Commandments say. Thou shalt not covet. What does that mean? Can I look at something in a store window and say, oh, I'd really like to have that one day? Is that allowed? This person is the expert who gets to tell you if that's allowed or not. Does that make sense? Okay, so what he says is, therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven. Now this is interesting because Jesus is a rabbi. He's not in the business of telling you or telling a scribe what to do or how to do their job. In fact, in the training hierarchy, the scribe is more like an intellectual PhD professor. So now Jesus is going to comment on scribes, and he's not saying any scribe. What kind of scribe is he talking about? Every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of... So what is this person doing? They're the people who are going to interpret and tell people how to live in the kingdom of heaven. Well, that's interesting. Who are these people? Who is he speaking to? The disciples. What is he saying to them? You are the legal experts on the kingdom of heaven. Now, if you were raised Jewish, would that be a daunting task? Yes. In fact, I wanted to know how you became a scribe because I didn't know. It turns out, maybe some of you have heard of this, there is an apocryphal book. It's called Sirach. Have you guys heard of this? Like if you bought a Catholic Bible, Sirach would be in there as part of the Apocrypha. Like I think some Lutherans and more liturgical churches still have it in their Bible. If you're not familiar, the Apocrypha is a collection of books that experts say are authentic to a time period. They speak in a way that's doctrinally sound, but they're not part of the scriptures. And so some people have kept them as kind of like a further reading to see behind the words of the Bible. Some people have just kicked them out to avoid confusion. This is not to be confused with some of the weird stuff like the Gospel of Thomas and all that kind of weird stuff. So this book, Sirach, was written about like 175 BC. My understanding is the author was the son of a well-known teacher, and he was more or less obsessed with the Proverbs and the Psalms, and he wanted to write kind of a wisdom literature style book. And so I decided to read some of it. And I looked into it, and it turns out that in chapter 38 and 39, which tells you how long this thing is, I assure you I did not read that much of it. I just used Google, because bless Google. This book tells you from 175 BC what the common understanding of an Orthodox Jew was on their expectations of what a scribe was and how a scribe became a good scribe. So it's in your footnotes. About halfway down it says this. Here are the descriptions. A good scribe should be free from labor. Like they should not have to do hard work. So, sweet. That sounds like every teenage boy I know wants to sign up for that. Right? Free to explore wisdom without any distractions. No chores. Somebody else is going to have to make the meals. No distractions. Able to seek the hidden meanings of the scriptures. They are committed to travel to hear the wisdom of others. They are a parent. So a good scribe is a parent. Why? Because the praise of other experts heap upon him. So when this scribe teaches, there's other experts traveling around listening and saying like, wow, that's a great interpretation. And how the chunk ends is that they are 1 in 1,000. So how rare are these guys? The well-to-do ones, the ones that are in high esteem. Very, very, very rare. Are you tracking with me? Okay. So these people are highly trained. They're highly, highly skilled. They are the best of the best of the best. These are the published writers. These are the philosophers. These are people who memorize the entire Old Testament, that quote ancient rabbis by name, that know every quotation. That's who a good scribe is supposed to be. Now, Jesus comes on the scene, and he gathers some fishermen and a tax collector, and he says, "Therefore, you guys are the scribes that are being trained for the kingdom of heaven." Isn't that crazy? What is he saying to them? I'm entrusting you with interpreting all the legal stuff necessary to enter the kingdom of heaven. Do you remember what it is? What is the most important commandment, they ask him? Love God. And when you do that, you inevitably love your neighbor. Got it? All right, you're qualified. You're in. You're the scribes. That's it. Isn't that awesome? If you truly love God, then you know your love for him is based on the fact that he sacrificed his one and only son. Whoever believes in him, like everything's wrapped up in there. That's it. Loving your neighbor as yourself. How come we're getting set to the side? How come we're goats? Because you didn't really do this at all, right? That's it. Now, I find it fascinating that Jesus has his disciples alone to teach them this, because it's only chapter 13. I think Jesus is walking out a timeline on purpose, whether we understand it all or not. He has a time on earth that he knows what he's doing. And I'm fairly certain that if he had said this out loud in mixed company around some of these people, they would have moved very quickly to eliminate him. So, let me make sure I'm on the same page here. Okay, so, therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven, that's you, is like a master of a house who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. Very interesting. I read this quote. Some of you probably know. Anybody familiar with R.C. Sproul? He wrote this. I think he's since passed away, right? Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, maybe more. But I read this, and I do this from time to time. I read it, and I just thought, you know what? In his 4 lines of quote, that pretty much is better than anything I could say with hours of training. So I'll just tell you what he said, and we'll move on. I put the quote in your outline, right? Yeah. Okay, cool. Those who are trained as a kingdom scribe, those disciples who have taken Jesus' yoke upon them, have seen and heard the special revelation of Jesus, which allows his people to see in the Old Testament kingdom truths that have been there since the foundation of the world, but which have largely gone unnoticed. And then he quotes Jesus from chapter 13. These new truths are the key to the right application of the scriptures, but they are not in opposition to the old truths evident apart from the parables of Jesus. I think he would say this, is that as we're reading the Old Testament now that we know who Jesus is, we read it looking back through Jesus, and we begin to see him everywhere. The theologian Karl Barth, who's probably even more famous than R.C. Sproul, he called this the golden thread. He said we are colorblind to the true gold, but when our eyes are open and we look back, we see this thread woven throughout every single page of the Bible. So the idea is, what is new is that Jesus has just given the disciples knowledge and understanding of how the kingdom works, of why some people get it and some people don't, of why people react in certain ways and other people react in others. He's given them all of this, and this is the new revelation of who he is and the kingdom he's bringing in. And just like Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. He's not saying the Old Testament is irrelevant. He's saying now that you have this understanding, now you get to bring out treasures of old that you didn't even know you had, because now you fully understand it. All the prophecies that are fulfilled in Jesus, you now see them for who they are because you're looking at the fulfillment right in front of you. For the sake of time, we're going to skip this question, but I would encourage you, if you're interested in that kind of thing, take it and ponder it for yourself. Verse 53, Actually, let's pause because we've kind of finished up the parables. Any thoughts or insights? Any questions? Steve?
What you're talking about with the scribes being in the kingdom, it brought to mind how the disciples were treated in Acts in the early church. How, like they said, they shouldn't be bothered with administering the feeding of the widows and orphans and so forth of the people. That they have to do this step right there. They were being treated by scribes, and they made them realize that was.
Okay, so I want to make sure I'm following you. So in Acts, the disciples are getting kind of pressed in on there's all these needs, and they don't leave the needs aside. They bring other people in that say, hey, this is part of your role, but we aren't to be bogged down with this stuff because we are the scribes who are supposed to be going out to tell people. I didn't think of that. Well, you thought about it before me, and you introduced it to me. It sounds great. Thanks, Steve. Anybody else got a comment or a question? I think it's crazy when you slow down, you read verse by verse, all of a sudden you're like, I do this all the time, like Hebrews. I know there's something in Hebrews that has 100%, like it's connecting a dot now that I didn't know was connected. I had somebody who was telling me like developmentally about my 3-year-old, and they were saying, he's still at the age where every synapse is firing and they're connecting all the brain chemistry that will last forever. I don't know if that's true, but it sounds cool. They were like, that's kind of like what happens when we read through the Bible, but ours never ends. The connections just keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going. It's, I think it was Augustine who said that the Bible is like the kiddie pool, more or less. You could drop your kids in and they're going to be safe, but you could also like jump off a ship into the depths and never find the bottom, and it's the same body of water. And I think that's kind of the idea. As we read through this, I'm just like blown away all the connections. It's also why we're told in the Bible to do scriptures together. Because I wanted to come up with that, Steve, and I appreciate you. And when Jesus had finished with these parables, verse 53, and he went away from there, and coming to his hometown, he taught them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished, and they said, where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown and in his own household. And he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. Ouch. So, this hometown, it's called Nazareth, right? By the way, do you remember this connection we talked about from Matthew chapter 1 about Nazareth? Do you guys remember it? It's super cool. You should look it up. I'll just give it to you really quick. The word Nazareth, do you remember what its root is? It's something that grows. Nobody? It's the stick town, like literally it's the sticks. And this is like I learned this before week 1. This is not like somehow I just know these things. I looked it up and learned it. And this root, stick, is actually the same root word in Hebrew that is actually translated as this. And this is what the prophecies say, the stump that grows off of what? Jesse. That's what you're looking for. You're looking for the one that grows the stump of Jesse. Isn't that cool? Yeah. It's awesome. So in one hand, Nathaniel can be like, Nazareth? I'm not following anyone who grew up in the sticks, right? He didn't read the prophecy well enough to know the connection. So Jesus goes to his hometown. Nazareth at this point, scholars are kind of a little split, but basically everyone says the population of Nazareth at this time is somewhere between 500 and 2,000. Anybody grow up in a town that is this size? Anybody in here? An elementary school was bigger, was that size? I grew up in a town that was small, but it was a little bigger than 2,000. And I got to tell you, I'll tell you a quick story. I think the town I grew up in, Penn Valley, somebody got an iPhone really quick? Just type in Penn Valley, California population. I'm just curious what it actually is. Somebody do it. I'm giving you permission to use a phone in church. Okay, so I got a driver's license. I actually got my driver's license on April Fool's, and the guy told me I failed, but that's a different story. On April 2nd, I get in the car to go to school for the very first time. Yeah. That small? Oh, yes. Yeah. What's that? Yeah, I'm one of the only ones. Okay, I don't know why I just circled my hometown population on the board. That's weird. Okay, but this is just an illustration. So on April 2nd, I get in the car and I drive to school. I go to school, all good, no problems. Feeling like pretty cool, pretty good about myself. I come home. My mom is a hairdresser in a town of 1,300. And when she gets home, she says, hey, I heard you were driving awfully fast on the way to school today. And I said, nah, who told you that? She's like, more than one person told me that. That's what happens in a small town. Now add into it that Nazareth is a small Jewish town that doesn't have cars, and everything is done in a tight-knit community. They all worship together. Their families are all interrelated. How well do these people know each other? They know each other like good, right? They know everybody's drama. You get in an argument with your spouse, and somebody overhears it, and everybody knows about it, right? This is this kind of town. I think there's an element here. Now, the story doesn't say this, so this is like me verging off of what the Bible says and moving into an opinion. But I think there is a piece of how would I describe it? I wrote it down, I think. I would call it what you think of as over-familiarity. That you think you know this guy so well and you know everything about him that when he shows up and he's not what you've been told, you are so sure that what you've been told is true and the person standing in front of you is a fraud and is fake and it can't be true. There's a few things that I think can add into this. Number one, they use some descriptions. They say, where did he get this wisdom and mighty works? Now, it has a question mark, but how many of you would say that's a legitimate question that they actually want to know the answer to? No. They've already come up with their answer because the very next thing out of their mouth is, this is a carpenter's son. He should be acting more like us, stick people, right? He should be acting more like us. He's a carpenter's son. In this world, unless you are some highly esteemed person, you just apprentice with your dad and continue the family business. And it's likely that Jesus actually probably did some of that. So how did he get this? We know his dad is. We know about his mom. We know his brothers, even calling them by name. We know his sisters. And then they ask the same question again, which is Matthew's way of telling you what just happened in between the two questions is what you should be focusing on. They think they know Jesus so well, Matthew goes overboard to even tell you exactly what they say. They think they know him so well that the real version of him is not real to them. That makes sense? I think this happens from time to time. We get an idea of who somebody is. Maybe it's somebody like on the news, for instance. And we have this idea, maybe it's a celebrity, maybe it's an athlete or something. We have this idea, it's been portrayed, it's been put out there, and then a scandal happens. And you think, I don't believe that's true, right? Not because you actually know them, but because you've consumed so much information and idea about who they are that when you hear the real thing, you're convinced that it can't be true, right? So how did he get all this? By the way, I put a footnote in here. This is not a fighting thing, but you may wonder, so if Jesus has brothers and sisters, and not only does he have them, they're called by name, how on earth does a huge chunk of the Jesus-believing population of the earth believe that Jesus is an only child? You guys know that that's true? Catholics believe that Jesus has no siblings. Do you guys know that? So what on earth do they do with this? I'll just tell you, there's a word in Greek, it's adelphos. It's the same word we get Philadelphia. Phila is love, and delphos is brotherly. So it's the word for brother. But this word can also at times be translated as cousin. And it can also sometimes be translated as I don't know how to describe it, I might have written it down actually. Yeah. Those from like a very tight-knit religious community. Now, if you took the class that we did before we did Matthew, we talked about translations. So what do you do when you come to this word in Greek, which is adelphos, like this? What do you do when you come to this word and you know, like, okay, it could be brother or cousin? It turns out that depending on which one you choose could like dictate an entire doctrine of who Jesus is and where he came from, right? So how do you choose? One of the first ways that you do it is you start in just the Bible and you say, let's find this word every single time, read it in context, and figure out in what instances can we tell for certain which way it's used. And you just start like tallying them up. And you just tally them up, right? And so it's almost like a percentage game, and you start to get a feel for in what sentence structure does it get used. The reason they do that is because Koine Greek is not a spoken living language. It's a dead language. So it turns out, I'm not trying to fight with anybody, it turns out that brother is the translation, not just in the Bible, but outside of the Bible, most of the time. Not all of the time, but most of the time. So I'm just telling you that because I don't think it's a real deal breaker, but I also think it's important to kind of be able to engage people on their own terms and not just fight over ridiculous things. Okay, so I think these people, they are seeing Jesus, and despite what's happening right in front of them, it says that he's teaching them, so they're hearing with their own ears what he's teaching. He's probably teaching the same things that are resulting in people following him elsewhere. They're hearing them. It says that he's performing some mighty works, so he's seeing it, and it still can't register. It's still not registering for them. They have this over-familiarity that they just know too much about him, and when he shows up, it just seems too fishy. It can't be true. There's also this cultural qualification question, and I told Victoria beforehand, this is actually a tough thing to figure out. If you had a child in the first century that ascended the Jewish learning all the way to being a rabbi, and we know that nobody ever says Jesus is not a rabbi. You notice that? Nobody ever says, you're wearing the fake garb of a rabbi, you're not the real thing, prove it. And if he wasn't, Pharisees would pick up on this and they would attack him for that. So they never do that. But it calls into question, how does his own hometown seem to not know? Is it that maybe they've accepted he is a rabbi and that's why he's allowed to teach? But they can't get past that he's more than a rabbi? I'm not totally sure exactly what that is. But they think they know him better than the real version right in front of them. And because of that, it says that they took offense at him. The taking offense is that they basically don't want him around to dirty up their reputation, which is kind of ironic because they live in the sticks. Yeah?
It seems like in the military, there's a concept that familiarity breeds contempt.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that.
People grew up with him, and so he was no better, they were like on the same level. And it's probably ego deflating for them to have to put him up on this pedestal where he belongs.
I have a little thing there. It says Andy's musing. That's a way better. I forgot about that phrase. That's what that means. But I was going to say I grew up in a small town, and if Jesus comes into their synagogues and it says that he teaches them, what does it say exactly? Let me flip the page. It says that he came into a hometown. He taught them in their synagogue. I was thinking, it doesn't say this, but what if he taught them the same things that he just taught everyone else? What if he just repeated the parables? And the parables were that if you know something other people don't know, it's worth leaving behind everything you knew to go get it. Whether it's a treasure in a field or it's a pearl, right? If they are so familiar with him, do they hear that as, oh, you think you're better than us? You just sold us out to go get a better thing? Could you hear that parable that way if you're already preloaded to react to this guy who you have contempt for? It's possible. So no matter what the interplay is, it says that because of their unbelief, he doesn't do many mighty works there. I think this is a good spot to stop, not just because of the time. It's a good place to stop because I think the warning should be clear. It should be clear that the people who think they know him the best are actually also at risk of totally missing him. I think this is the goats. This is we totally know you. And if we had known it was you, we would have given people something to eat, right? So I think it's something to think about and pray, as there is a feeling that the closer you get to Jesus, is there a point where you get so familiar with him where you just anticipate that you know what Jesus would do? Right? I think it's like the WWJD bracelet. I don't need the Bible. I just ask this. What would Jesus do? Yeah, I can just assume I know what he would do instead of continuing to come back to his word and being surprised by sometimes he pokes you with a hot stick to convict you of sin that you didn't know you had, right? Sometimes he says things that you're like, bro, calm down. For real. Remember when he goes into the disciples' hometown and the first thing he does is just like starts saying all kinds of crazy stuff? They're like, man, chill out. I think if we don't come back to God's word and we just assume that, oh, I've read it before, I know him, that we are in the same boat as these people are at. It's 7:33. Let me pray a blessing over you, and then we'll dismiss. You're welcome to hang as long as you'd like. God, your word is awesome, and we love it. We love all the things that it brings up and out of us. Thank you that you created us in a way that we're just curious people and we're eager to learn. And God, I pray as we continue to dive deeper into your word that we wouldn't settle for knowing you pretty good, but we would really pursue knowing you. So God, would you help us every single day? Would you catch our attention? Would you bring smiles to our faces? Would you bring just the heartbreak of injustice into our lives? Would you help us to walk out what it means to be a true disciple? So we give ourselves to you. We desperately want to be people who would leave everything behind to follow you, and we just acknowledge now that we aren't always like that. So would you give us courage and boldness? Would you reveal the things that we should probably leave behind? And as we do so with our brothers and sisters together, would you just use each of us to speak life and courage and hope and conviction and everything that goes with it into one another. So we love you. We give you everything that we have, and we ask for more of you. Amen. Amen. Hey, thanks for coming.